we're going to dive into a conversation around how do we really build community through our lessons learned, the challenges, and what lies ahead. So, Emily, I'll start with you.
Sure.
A long career, many organizations. What would you say are the lessons you've learned in this endeavor?
I think the first lesson is really about the landscape of the work, right? Philanthropists and philanthropy were kind of always on the other side. So you love them, but you hate them as well, right? Because they have the resources, so you love them, and you hate the fact that you need, 12 months to even have a first conversation about funding work that you feel is really important, that is answering your own purpose or your community's purpose. And so I think the first lesson learned has been, let's redefine that. Let's redefine that narrative. Let's look at philanthropy as a tool. Let's look at philanthropists as more than just people writing the checks. And so what does that mean practically, especially when you're working on an issue like gender equality, I think is really, really important. The lessons learned has been that partnership has to be authentic from the very beginning of the process. And it's also been that the philanthropic sector is actually structured in a way that makes it really difficult for the folks that we're talking about, or that I'm talking about, grassroots women's rights organizations, to make it work, to enter partnerships. And it's not so much because of, stereotypes on what they can or cannot do. It's more about just practical barriers. They don't speak the same language. So one of, lessons learned is, how do you develop a joint language, a joint narrative to kind of get along through the process of doing good? How do you, as someone who has a lot of power and resources, get to listen instead of maybe talking to begin with? So the language, that is a huge, problem, and there are great models out there of how you can go beyond that. It's not it's a barrier, but it's not something that you can't overcome. The second lessons learned for me has been, bringing it back to this question of purpose. Like, as philanthropist, as the philanthropic community that I've had the privilege of working with for many years, what is the purpose behind the act of giving? And what's wonderful with working with grassroots women's rights organizations is that it's often very clear. I think when you approach a bigger international organization, there's so much going on. It's part of an industry. Actually, it's really hard to put your finger on that purpose. When you approach, the Women's March chapter in Bamenda, Cameroon, they'll tell you our purpose is the conflict issue. That's what we're giving our lives for. This is how we're doing it. So do you want to tag along and be part of this process? So language, identifying purpose, and then lessons learned of bringing humility to the work. I think purpose is about listening to your own purpose and identifying it. It's also about hearing and listening to others. And you might not carry the same purpose than someone else. And so as someone with power and resources, how do you make that work for the kind of work that you want to invest in?
So, Tara, can you kind of take it from a different perspective of corporations, private partnerships, lessons learned? I mean, it's been stated that millennials and Gen Z will focus on where they buy their goods and services from based on the culture and authenticity of the organization and the company. Which you saw in your presentation. So can you talk about the lessons you've learned in working in private partnerships?
Yeah, I think that Emily really hit it on the head for me in terms of the authenticity of the partnerships, and one might not expect that you need that necessarily in the private sector, and in fact, I think that's where you need it the most. One of the organizations that I've had the privilege of working with is called Girls Who Code, which is trying to close the gender gap in technology. In the US is where it started, but now it's increasingly going global. And the power of their model is not just that they're trying to solve an incredibly important aspect of gender inequality, but they're also trying to solve a problem, a business problem for the industry, and responding to data, although we don't have enough of it yet, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, but responding to specific data sets and certainly anecdotal examples in culture about how underrepresented women are in the technology field, particularly in those more technical roles. So it's not just enough for women to be serving in HR or marketing functions. They need to be where the product development and design is happening. I mean, just as an aside, one of the things that Girls Who Code talks about is, I don't know if how many of you have AirPods, the things that just stick in your ear, but those were not designed by women, because for those of us who wear earrings every day, those were not designed by women. So there is a business imperative around getting more diversity into the places and spaces where products are being developed, where new technologies are being designed. And so for Girls Who Code, they have this really wonderful, authentic connection to a business problem that the technology industry is trying to solve. Where that linear narrative isn't as clear, it can be more challenging. It can be harder to find the through line from a private sector company who wants to do good in the space, but isn't really sure how to get started. And I do see that a lot. But then again, I go back to, in terms of a lesson, it's the importance of data. And recently, NARAL, one of the leading, I want to get these stats right, they're new, NARAL, one of the leading pro-choice organizations in the United States, did a survey of employees, employed adults, that indicated that companies should be just as vocal about and supportive of reproductive freedom as they are when it comes to other issues that they stand up for. So equal pay, LGBTQ rights, and voting rights. So there might be this perception in the space that companies don't want to touch something, but or companies don't want to touch something because there's a perception that customers and employees don't want them to go there. But this survey says that 67% of respondents felt that it was important for their employer to take a stand on reproductive freedom, including abortion. So we have to kind of get underneath what's actually going on using data, particularly in the gender space, where we just frankly have a lot less of it that we need to make effective decisions.
So Uma, maybe you could give us lessons learned prior to January 2017, and then what a monumental movement since then, what lessons have you learned from there? Because they're probably different.
So prior to January 2017, I was a chemistry teacher at a school in Geneva. So prior to January 2017, I think the thing that still sticks with me is how deeply embedded systemic patriarchy is on every level. So when I'm engaging with the philanthropic community, I still have to navigate those systemic biases on a daily basis. And it's not only intimidating, but sometimes equal parts terrifying, which is one of the reasons why we started our systems change grants, because we wanted to make it incredibly easy for anybody to be able to create small points of change. We have to, one of the things that I think about a lot is that even though I think on the Forbes 2018 list, 200 women were finally on the billionaires list. It was the highest percentage ever, but still the global wealth continues to be dominated by white men. But it is women who are giving to women's causes and not men, and men continue to uphold systemic patriarchy and misogyny. So if we are to succeed as a global movement, we need men to be able to enter into this conversation and really take ownership for changing and unraveling this fabric that continues to oppress us all. I think moving forward, as we're looking at what we do at Women's March Global, we want people to be brave in these discussions. The discussion that our chapter in Harare had around the rapes that the army was doing in Zimbabwe, it took immense courage for them to be able to do that. That's speaking against a government institution. So as philanthropists, I need you to be brave and not just see if we're going to succeed in another year or if we're going to fail, but dive in with us so that we can tackle those challenges. Many times I hear, well, we're going to wait and see if how you all do and how it goes. But these issues are so pressing. They're so challenging, and we need you to jump in now with us.
Excellent. Vendela, will you share with us some of the things you've seen here in the Swedish economy and kind of your work in the private sector as well as in politics?
Yes, and I think I would like to start by just raising a round of applause of these amazing women. I mean, could you notice like when they started their organizations in 2017 and 18 and the magic work that they've done in just 1 or 2 years? It's like, wow. I am so impressed, and I really sit in front of all of you today as a result of Swedish welfare, to be honest, because I had a farmer grandmother, and my mother was the first one in her family going to university, becoming a doctor, and so I grew up seeing my mother work.
Thank you.
And also a stay-at-home dad who could be with me and to nurture my belief in myself. And coming out in the workforce, I kind of realized that this is not a background that everyone has been through. Like, I am a very unique case here, and it's truly interesting to think about like living in Sweden and being born in the 1990s. You would think that gender equality is that we have solved this issue. But when I started working, I realized that we have a lot of things to do still, and especially in the private sector, I would say. And what really was my... sorry, I lost it a little bit there. I was like in a story, and then what I wanted to share with you was that in 2016, there was a very important election in the United States. And that was the thing that tripped me over, because I literally realized that if not now, who will act on this? And so I decided to quit my job to start working with this full time, to make sure that all women would have that same possibility to be equally treated as men. And so the experiences that I can share with you is that after that year, I had this question, like, who could fund my activism? And I would really need this sort of setting. Like this sort of setting would be perfect for me, like 2 years ago. And the key there is really transparency to how can we oh my God, it's like really hard not being, sorry, I was like thrown in here yesterday, so it's like, I haven't really prepared. But what I really wanted to say is that you as philanthropists, and you sit at Capital, you could really like try to find your, it's a Swedish word called eldsjäl, and like to find those people who have the courage to like maybe jump off their jobs and start moving on their passion. And in order to do so, we need access to your knowledge, and we also need your networks. So a good way could be to start talking and asking around and see if you can find these people, that the eldsjälar, because that's really how we can move forward.
Tara, I want to have you take the next question, which is we've learned lessons, but we often don't talk about the challenges that we have to endeavor in order to learn those lessons. Usually at philanthropic forums and conferences, we're always talking about what's working and the good, rather than actually connecting on where we're challenged and where we may actually get to come together as a global community. So can you talk about the challenges that you faced at VOW in putting this together? And it's amazing what you've done in such a short period of time, but I'm sure it wasn't easy along the way.
No, and it continues to not be easy, even as there are exciting moments, right? We're just at the beginning of what we hope will be an incredible journey. I think what I have learned is that, from the vision, the big vision of this idea of mobilizing an industry around a particular issue, from vision to execution, there's a lot that has to get done. And I think that the challenge, not just in the wedding industry, but in industry or in the private sector more broadly, is around, one, I think, varying levels of sophistication and experience around jumping in with these issues because they may be unfamiliar, they may frankly require resources, in some cases significant resources, and a reimagining of the way that a particular company does business. And that can be difficult and that can be scary and it can be expensive. But I would also say, in terms of the second challenge, referencing what you described in terms of the imperative to just jump in and to, I think, apply a lot of the same risk-taking orientation that one might have from a business lens to philanthropy. And I think, Vendela, we were talking a little bit about this prior to the start of the conference, and I may show a lot of different biases here, but in terms of gender equality, I'm tired of the nibbling at the edges, right? I'm tired of, the sort of small program here, or sort of, frankly, just the sort of artisan type of approach for certain women in communities where it's like a program of certain size is considered sufficient in terms of, in this framework, corporate responsibility and social responsibility. I mean, the reality is, 263 years or 53? 53 years. 253, only 253 years to get to gender parity. I mean, we need huge and transformational bets that are, in fact, highly risky. And we need to just say that. And maybe that's what we need to start saying in a lot of these forums. We can't really afford to wait if women are going to acquire what I believe are the two most critical levers for parity, for success, economic power and political power. Then you have to leapfrog over these sort of at the margin solutions and programmatic approaches to say, how can we come together as philanthropists? I do think there's a nod to Vow there, because the Girls First Fund is a donor collaborative. It's a bunch of funders coming together and saying, how can we do this more effectively together? And there just need to be bigger bets.
Yeah. So Emily, bigger bets, usually larger nonprofit organizations that have been around a long time are slower to move because they have fiduciaries, committees of people, trustees. They're often removed from the work. Talk about why grassroots organizations are so critical to moving faster, and the challenges that those grassroots organizations kind of find themselves in on the ground, and also in the marketing and attracting the credibility that they deserve, because they are really the seeds that have these movements take off.
Yes, absolutely. We had a really interesting point made earlier, I think it was Uma during her talk, the link between the local and the global. And I think especially in the philanthropic sector, it's very interesting, but I mean in any sector, right? The need to put labels on things and to kind of determine a geography of action and a scale of action, rather than looking again at this common thread of purpose and what we're trying to achieve. So what grassroots women's rights organizations, and what I mean by grassroots women's rights organization is literally an organization of women and men fighting for issues in their community, and for constituents, right? So it could be a very small organization in a village, but it can also be a national level, powerful women's rights organization in a country. So it's a broad definition, and that also sometimes is part of the challenge. But I just wanted to make sure that everybody understood that. But so, when I would approach donors and I would say, I hear you care about economic growth. That's wonderful. You care about economic growth in West Africa. For whatever reason and purpose or agenda that is, let me explain to you how investing in these 100 women's rights organizations in West Africa might actually, triple the GDP within the next 25 years. And there's data behind that. There's data from the World Bank, there's data from foundations. I mean, it's out there. And so I think the challenge has always been legitimizing and placing grassroots women's rights organizations in the landscape of action. And I think that a lot of donors, you know, if we're looking at individual donors, I think often the problem is that those connections are not easy to have. So unless you're going through a third party, you know, you can sit here thinking, I would love to fund a women's rights organization in China or wherever. How do I get to them? And there's a lack of awareness of the mechanisms that exist, so like the women's funds or even the fact that these organizations are often online, vibrant, and that you can find them quite easily. So that's one thing. As a small family foundation, that you're also going to have the problem of relationship and access, even though you would actually probably be a perfect match in terms of grant making. And as a big foundation, unfortunately, often it's not sexy enough, right? You have a portfolio of, I don't know, $180 million that you want to fund. And I'll give you a brief story that literally happened to me. I was running an organization that was a network of grassroots organizations. So we weren't really a grassroots organization per se. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation launched this whole new gender equality portfolio a few years ago, now probably 4 years ago. And we were all very excited about it. It was $100 million, which is nothing, but we were still very excited about it. And they literally said to my face, and in their defense, after a while, they actually did fund us. But the initial reaction was, we don't want to give anything less than $2 million. And I was telling them, if you give me $1 million, within the next 2 years, I can sustain and strengthen 400 women's rights organizations in 50 countries. I can also give them grants for them to localize this fight that clearly we all care about. I mean, it was the perfect product. I know, I'm not being very objective. But anyway, so I think there's a problem in understanding the landscape where these organizations fit in. There's a lack of awareness in the philanthropic sector as to what that can look like, and maybe that's on us to share more stories about what these kinds of investments can do as well.
Yeah, I also think we box ourselves into certain things, right?
Yeah.
We say we only can fund 2 million and up, when in reality that million would have been as effective as a $2 million grant. Vendela, will you talk about challenges? So you left your job. You mobilized, like a lot of us in America, because you were upset about something. Talk about the challenges in leaving your job and starting this, and what you see today, 2 to 3 years later.
That is a good question. I think one of the big things that happened was that I saw a huge structure. And when you see this huge structure, which you could call the patriarchy or systematic inequality, you as a little person, it's becoming very hard to see the change because you're just seeing this massive problem. And really what the learning would be, so you wouldn't be so frustrated, is to break down this system. And this is something that you talked about, like how you can create system change by thinking about the small actions. So, well, first learning, someone has to fund your activism. Someone has to make sure that you pay your bills. You have the responsibility to yourself. And the second one is really that it's easier to do things together. So the more people you can mobilize and the better you are at mobilizing an organization, the more efficient the whole, I would say, struggle or fight would be. So this is not a one-man's issue. And the third lesson that is really the hardest is to battle that imposter syndrome. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That could lead to a massive blackout during a panel. But it's also this doubt in yourself that is this enough? Is this really changing the world? This battling gender equality, what can I do? My little actions here. And we just need to encourage each other there. And we just need to look at the small actions and really support everyone who is in this. And so we are not our own enemies, if you're feeling me. And so be kind to the people around you. And whenever, if they're gonna, it doesn't matter if they quit their job or if they're just fundraising a dinner or throwing away millions of dollars, it's every action counts. And we really have to make sure to lift up from under and help everyone.
Great. So, Uma, everyone's part of your movement or could be part of your movement. It doesn't have to be the wealthy or the philanthropist or some big corporate entity. 81 countries, one day, multiple days. Rather than the challenges, will you talk about what you see for the future of collaboration around gender equality and where we go from here?
It's a big question. The future for us lies with our community. And I say that because the community is at the heart of everything that we do at Women's March Global. We have, and I think this is why, for me, I quit my job teaching to join this organization full time after volunteering with the organization from the very beginning of its origins. We have people within our organization that are volunteering their time, energy, effort, and money alongside kids, alongside families, alongside jobs, alongside sickness, alongside health. Our amazing community ambassador here in Stockholm, Lotta, unfortunately lost her son 2 years ago. And she wrote this amazingly beautiful piece about disability rights in Sweden and the challenges of disability rights in Sweden. That would not have come about if she did not take her own personal stories and struggles and use her voice to share that. Our community and the future of this movement is about understanding our shared humanity. I know that it is a challenge when I speak about things that make people uncomfortable, but I am a huge fan of uncomfortable conversations. If you can sit with me in an uncomfortable conversation for 10 minutes and we can do it, and this is our team motto at Women's March Global, our motto is radical love and empathy in all conversations, because we deal with really intense global issues. If you can sit with me in an uncomfortable conversation for 10 minutes, we can really take a giant step forward in what we know to be this fight for human rights. I'm not just talking about women's rights, I'm talking about human rights. When we're talking about this, what the future looks like, we're such a long way from that. But there is so much hope, because I know the people in our community, and I know their commitment. I know your commitment. You're sitting in this room, you're listening to us. So I know that there is possibility. And that's what gives all of us hope within the work that we do.
Yeah, I would argue that if we can sit with anyone for 10 minutes and have an uncomfortable conversation, imagine what we could actually move forward. Tara, do you want to focus on the private sector and what's going to be required for the future to be possible?
I mean, I think a lot of it is that openness again. And I mean, Jen, I know your work, and you'll probably reference it and talk about it. You know better the sort of the levers that the private sector can utilize, which I do think are going to be critical in this next phase. So it's not just thinking about philanthropy in the traditional sort of check writing model, but if you look at an issue such as the percentage of venture capital that goes to women entrepreneurs, which is basically at 2%, and then you're not even layering on top of that women of color entrepreneurs and founders. I mean, there's just a huge opportunity. You have to imagine, even though that isn't my space, how incredible it could be to sort of put a philanthropist lens on that business opportunity, merge them together, and really think about what are the other ways to be using impact investing capital, how are you managing your portfolio, what are you invested in, to sort of move by leaps and bounds into some of these spaces. I think that Goldman Sachs, when they started 10,000 Women and that program, it was an incredible model, and it aligned very much with their business goals. And I think companies need to be doing more of that, more really deep thinking and strategic analysis about what are the ways that my particular company and industry can contribute to a more gender equal world, particularly because whether you're a Goldman Sachs or a wedding gown designer, there is that expectation that that companies are going to stand behind and beside people who are advocating for basic human rights. And the good news is there's a lot more ways to do that than there had been previously. And so getting a facility and a sort of comfort level with all of those different levers, I think is going to be critical in the future.
Yeah, I would just like to add on to that, that when you're going to start a movement at a corporate level, make sure your corporate values and what you do at the corporate level also mirror that. So I'd like to challenge Goldman Sachs to at least get to pay equality amongst their senior level
Goes back
executives.
to authenticity, right?
Absolutely. So I love that you brought that up. So Emily, we're going to let you take us home before we open it up for Q&A from the audience. What's the future you see? And maybe could you share a little bit about kind of the work you're taking on now? Because I do think quantifying feminism today is super important so that everyone, including the men, can join the movement.
Yes, we want the men. We love the men. You know, it's funny because I've had this feeling for a few years now, and when I was executive director of a nonprofit, I really saw this shift happening. We're two shifts. The first one is the development industry and sector is rapidly changing. Some people will tell you it is dying. I think it's transforming for the better. I think a lot of the models we were using until now are just not working anymore and they don't make sense. So, you know, think big NGO with like portfolios of programs with no local partnerships. It's 2019. Nobody does that anymore. So in front, you know, facing this transformation, what's beautiful is that we're seeing these new communities emerge that are actually kind of hybrid communities of philanthropists, activists, nonprofit executives, and you know we're part of some. Like we're friends with our philanthropists and donors, and but it's more than friendship. It's communities of thought and transformation that are really taking on some of these big challenges. And when you have obviously allies in the private sector, that's even better. So I think I'm very hopeful that we're changing how we're operating, and that we're going towards models that are more inclusive, more impactful, and honestly, where folks on the giving side of things have way more fun, right? They're involved. They know the people they're, you know, supporting. They understand the issues. They're asked to talk about the issues. So I think I'm very hopeful for that, and I think that's very exciting. I also think, you know, and I guess it's both a challenge, a lessons learned, and a future thing. But, you know, feminism is a big word. I think we can spend hours deciding of whether it's the right word or not. I think what's fascinating is that we're realizing, and by we I mean really everyone, women and men in the private sector, you know, in politics, that we have this collective purpose. And you know, we've talked a lot about gender equality, and for those of you who know me, it's no surprise. But really, the point also of this morning was, okay, purpose, right? And whether you like it or not, every single big issue today is linked to this. And I think that awareness raising is really important. If you want to, as a philanthropist, defend, you know, economic empowerment for all, you're going to have to invest in gender equality. If you want to look at democracy and citizenship issues, you're going to have to invest in gender equality. If you want to look at climate change. So I think it's such a beautiful entry point for our collective purpose and for also how, you know, we're funding some of these items. So the work I'm doing now, I just launched an initiative called This Is What Feminist Leadership Looks Like, because I was hearing from a lot of people on the philanthropic side, on the practitioner side, on the activist side. Of course I'm a feminist, I don't know what feminist leadership looks like. How do I take my values and my purpose and actually turn it into an everyday behavior? You know, actions, whether, again, what do I invest in? Where do I put my money? But not just where do I put my money? How do I fund gender equality work in a way that is living feminist values? And that's about inclusion and diversity and about looking and having those difficult conversations, uncomfortable conversations about power and privilege. So I think that we need to, you know, embrace the tools we have. I think feminism is a tool, and it's doing a lot of good. And a lot of philanthropists and even the private sector, we're getting there. And so I'm hopeful about what's coming.
Excellent. We're breaking down silos. All right. Are there any questions from the audience? We have a few minutes. If you raise your hand, we can try to get you a mic. Don't be shy.
Hi, Philip Chow. I'm curious to know, how do you work with partners to agree on the definition for feminism? And whether that is something that can get subjective based on different localities, and how do you see that between like a regional / global work? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's such an important question. And a lot of time feminist work means that you're not even going to pronounce that word. But it also means that you find sometimes the courage to open that door as well. So, we were supporting women's rights organizations in countries like Somalia, South Sudan. There's not even a local word for feminism. But there are local values about equality. There are local, sayings and words that describe equality and partnership and collaboration. So I think, it depends of the moment you're in and where you're at and the value of the impact of bringing it in. I think in a setting, I've been doing work lately with executive directors of nonprofits and philanthropists. I think there's a worth in putting it on the table. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about feminism, because also if you don't say it, then folks can't say, I'm uncomfortable with that word. And people say that a lot. And that's okay. That's the starting point for our conversation. So I think beyond the cultural sensitivity, it's about a strategy. How are you going to get to what you're trying to get to? And how does the word and the concept and speaking it help you along that strategy?
How do you see that men can support and activate themselves?
I'd say March.
Yes, absolutely. That would be the very basic thing to do. I think, to go off of what Emily was saying about feminism, we need to understand that feminism has shifted. The feminists of the 60s are not the same as the feminists of 2019. And the issues are also very radically different. I said this before and I'll keep on saying it. Men are the upholders of patriarchy. You need to get into the trenches. And I'm married to a half Frenchman, half Englishman, very white dude. And I say to him all of the time, the best way that you can be my ally, because being an accomplice is something very different. The best way that you can be my ally is to get in the trenches with me and speak up when I experience injustice, because I live in Switzerland, I'm a woman of color. It happens quite often, unfortunately. For men, it is intimidating. I understand that. But if you sit with your discomfort, that is the first step. Sit with your discomfort. Why is that space of existing within a women's movement uncomfortable for you? Because it's challenging your own status quo. It's challenging the ingrained power structures that we all come up with. But if you can do that, there's so much power within that to help propel you and join us literally in this movement, in this march.
I would just like to also add, you have a mother, oftentimes a sister, a wife, it may be your daughter. You control the boardrooms. Imagine if it was your mother, daughter, child that wasn't invited in.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say that it's we often rely on human beings to change this kind of battle. But I think it's like when you ask, like, what can I do as a man? Sometimes I think it's maybe easier to change the systems in terms of, let's say, recruitment processes. Like, how can we remove the unconscious bias and let actually machines do the work instead? Because there are judgments and prejudgments and biases that we won't be able to remove. I mean, we will learn how to navigate in a social context and get educated and woke. But maybe we will speed up this process by just iterating the systems a little bit.
Can I, real quick? And I think there are different levels to that question. I think it's really important to separate them. The first level is as an individual, as a man, as a white woman. How do we as individuals show up in the world in a way that is letting others have what we have? So I think that's the first level, and that we can talk about that for hours. I think the second level is that there is this collective and, kind of, there are these collective and systemic patterns where men are actually best positioned to address them. And I think that the feminist movement and the women's rights movement and anybody who's serious about gender equality needs to have really impactful strategies to allow those entry points. And then the final stage for me is more of a conceptual discussion level, right? I've had long conversations with executive directors in the nonprofit world and philanthropists about we don't understand why we can't be included in these initial discussions. And so raising awareness with our male colleagues and friends and partners about how models that work well to really lead social change for gender issues starts with often women self-organizing, because there's a need, for women to come together, address these issues, and go back into the world. I think the mistake we often make is not explaining that that is just the first step. That is not the whole process. The second step is, where are our allies? How can, our husbands, our male colleagues be part of this? And I think that's the uncomfortable piece of it. As much as I think, again, as a white woman, I have left rooms because I know the importance of my colleagues of color to be together and discuss certain issues that I would not be able to really contribute to, I think, or not at that first step level. Afterwards, absolutely. So I think the second level of the last level of the question is the process, right? How do we make the world a better, more gender equal world? Men are part of it, absolutely. But at what moment and how? I think we've got a lot of work to explain that and do it right.
I would just add one quick thing too. I mean, the nuances are not to be underestimated, especially given I work a lot in the girls space. And I think, especially for me, my vantage point is the US, there's all of this sort of cultural dialogue about girl power and girls can do this, that, and anything. And the reality is it's particularly heightened with the child and marriage issue, but these are children. It's our responsibility collectively to shift culture, political systems. It's not their job. I mean, they have limit. I believe that sincerely, that girls and boys have limitless potential if we just don't get in the way. It's our job as the grown-ups, frankly, in the world, to understand what are the best ways for us to create pathways for young people's success, in particular girls, because they have been so underrepresented and will continue to be so unless we change. And for that, of course, we need men.
Yep.
Of course we do.
All right, last question.
Yes, my name is Ahmad Rahman. I'm the founder of the Global Village Foundation, which works with social, political, and economic integration between new Swedes, first, second generation, and older Swedes who've been here for a generation. I know you already mentioned a lot of, especially now the last question, but my question to you is that the business leaders, the founders, how do we make sure that, first of all, they live up to themselves being a role model? Because there's also a risk when you're working so close to each other that they give the money away, but then they don't change themselves. And then also that the big business focuses on funding huge projects, while they most of the time ignore small local projects. I guess in the US it's different because charity is perhaps a little bit more established, but in Sweden we find it very difficult for big businesses here to contribute to vulnerable areas, for example, in the suburbs. So how do we make sure that we don't forget the local context, and how do we make sure that big businesses don't wash their hands away by giving a lot of money?
I think an interesting point that we often fail to talk about when we're hanging out with philanthropists is the advocacy point. There's an untapped potential of advocacy from within the philanthropic sector. And I'm not sure why that is, because I'm an observer in that sector more than a doer, but I think we're starting to see philanthropists organize before even going to the issues they want to support. How do we create a philanthropic ecosystem that matches the needs, right? So in a country like Sweden, in a country like France, and then building those communities to advocate. So I think I think we'll see a lot more of that in the future. And I think it's exciting when we see philanthropists go to activists asking for help, because for once, like, you have resources that we need. Let's partner. So that when you were asking that question, I was thinking of that, and I think especially in European countries, we're going to see more and more of that.
Ahmed, I think you raised a really good point there with the washing about like when business leaders throw some money or capital to this matter. I don't think this is intentional, that they're just doing this to get it off their hands. I honestly think it's about knowledge, that you lack of knowledge how to implement it in your company. So I think we need to, like, as groups, need to go together, grassroots movements, private sector, politics, to implement policies in organizations. Because then we wouldn't have the washing, because they would know what resources to put in, how to execute it, how to map it, which KPIs to be used, and all that, to not be needing the washing process. So I think transparency and like sharing knowledge is really key here.
And I think going back to Jen's point, alignment around values. And that's probably a space where the private sector, again, needs to just do a lot of work and thinking alongside people like these folks.
Just to close out, I was recently at a tech summit with a foundation, and they were interested in funding projects that would help educate people in low-income communities, but the funds were really only available for people who were ready to be educated. And my question to them was, what does that mean? And are we not, if that's how you measure impact by only funding people who show up at your door, but not actually addressing the systemic issues and barriers that keep people from showing up at your door, how is that impact? And how are we measuring impact? And so when you're looking as philanthropists and funders at impact, are you only looking at your KPIs because they look good as numbers? And I'm a former scientist, I get it, numbers look good. But at the end of the day, if we're not understanding how deeply embedded systems change actually is, and that it's much deeper work than just looking at KPIs and showing who, funding who comes to your door, than doing the work, then it's a complete missed opportunity.
Yeah, we have to go beyond writing the check, and we have to be raising our voices, writing the check, and doing the hard work on the ground. Ladies, thank you so much for your leadership, your commitment, and for being a stand that the world works for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.